And welcome back to another video. This is Thousand Ant and I'm Matt Shell. And in this video, I want to talk about a couple of games that I've seen coming out recently that have done reasonably well and why I think it's an interesting thing to think about in your own game making strategy as you're choosing what type of game to make. Let's get started. So, the games that I'm talking about are two games. One is a game called SNKRX, and another is a game called Vampire Survivors. Now, just on a pure playing fun games level, I recommend that you check them out. They're both pretty cool and enjoyable. And from a kind of an indie game dev business standpoint, I think they're interesting and worth looking at because both of them have made a certain amount of money. I would say they both look like they're profitable. And they're both pretty small and simple and not graphically expensive, right? They're both pixel art games with pretty simple artwork in different ways, and they kind of rely on relatively kind of old school arcade-like mechanics, although maybe even like simpler than some of the old school arcade mechanics. Combined with these procedural, combinatorial game mechanics, which I think are pretty interesting. SNKRX is made by ADN, who I've actually talked about on this channel before. I responded to an article that he wrote about when not to market your game and linked to his blog, and I recommend that you check it out. And he is an interesting, very contrarian thinker and game developer who is kind of pushing against mainstream consensus in a lot of ways. I definitely don't agree with all of his opinions, but I think he's an interesting voice in the sense that he's definitely not following the kind of mainstream orthodoxy, and he's having some success with it, right? So SNKRX, to give a brief description of it, is a kind of a run-based game, which is in this loosely roguelike related area, although at this point we're so far from kind of traditional roguelike games like Rogue or NetHack that we probably need a new genre to describe them. But it's basically a game that relies on randomness and then randomly dispensed power-ups, right? And this is actually I would say the key common mechanic between Vampire Survivors and SNKRX is that we have this simple arcade gameplay, and then every so often you level up and you get to choose between 3 different power-ups, and the power-ups stack and combine in kind of uneven and spiky ways, right? And this is something that we also saw in games like Slay the Spire, where you could get these kind of overpowered builds, right? If you got certain cards that would like double certain effects, and you could stack a bunch of them and have like crazy overpowered damage, which is kind of part of the fun of all 3 games. It's a little bit of a power fantasy, right? I think some of the excitement of it is that you might get a certain combination of power-ups that leads to like a really overpowered build that lets you go really far, right? So they're kind of combining this very simple gameplay, right, where in both Vampire Survivors and SNKRX, you're literally just moving, and your character or your avatar automatically shoots, and depending on what power-ups you have, you shoot in different ways, or you shoot or you spawn little damage-causing things, or you spawn healing objects or whatever it is, right? But basically it's auto-firing, and you're just moving to both avoid enemies and choose where you're shooting and what you're hitting, right? So all you're doing is moving and upgrading, and that's true in both SNKRX and Vampire Survivors. And I think it's a really cool example of a kind of a mechanical compression on one hand, where we're really, really minimal in terms of inputs. It's almost like an idle clicker game in some regards, right? Where we're making really minimal input, but we're making kind of strategic choices in terms of upgrades. And then combining it with this random element of we don't know what choices we're gonna be offered, and we don't know where, for example, the next enemies are gonna spawn, so you can't really learn the pattern, although there are like macro patterns. And what I see there is that the developers have deployed a kind of a minimum amount of game code and mechanics to try to create a large potential combinatorial space. And I think this is a really interesting superpower of procedural generation strategies and of combinatorial game mechanics. And we're seeing them kind of working together here, where we have these really simple game designs, but because we have this mix of randomness and combination, we get this pretty rich possibility space in terms of gameplay. And this is, for me, one of the most interesting areas is, you know, we use this word emergence sometimes, right? Where we see this kind of greater amount of complexity emerging from a small initial starting set of conditions or seed, right? And I think that these games are both showing kind of cool emergent properties in the sense that you're starting from something that is mechanically really simple set of rules, pretty narrow set of choices, but then you're getting a lot of fun gameplay out of it. And I think that the important business layer of this is that these are small games with simple art that are relatively simple to produce, and they're selling them for cheaply. So Vampire Survivors is around $3 US, depending on where you are in the exchange rate. And they've grossed, I think, around 4 million USD using the kind of Boxlighter method of reviews times 50 times revenue. Probably means a net of around $1.3 million that they actually take home, right? Which is a significant success for a small, relatively lo-fi, pixel art, simple game, right? They've definitely made enough money to make another one of these, right? So anytime I see something like that where I'm like, okay, a small and simple game is kind of punching above its weight, I think it's worth looking at and noticing. This came to my attention because Chris Zukowski was talking about it on his mailing list. I'd already been following SNKRX, so when he was like, oh, this is a kind of an SNKRX-like, I was like, oh, okay, let me go check it out. And I downloaded it and I played it a lot. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. I've actually really been playing it a lot and really enjoying it. And I see that it's a small game that's succeeding economically. So I think it's pretty worth thinking about and talking about as a kind of an indie game strategy. Another game that I'll compare it to, both because it has this kind of amount of difficulty, simple mechanics, and this feeling of kind of getting swarmed by hordes of monsters, is Devil Daggers, which is one of my all-time favorite games. I've spent a lot of hours in it doing, you know, runs that are between like 2 and 5 minutes long on the like extreme outside. And Devil Daggers is another great example of really stripping things away, create something that's very simple and very refined, but very enjoyable, and that, not coincidentally, is, I think, a viable strategy for indie game makers. So this is an area I'm really interested in exploring, both from a kind of a game design and a business perspective, is what is the smallest kind of kernel of gameplay that we can make that can kind of blossom outwards into lots of fun gameplay possibilities. You know, another game that I have like a, you know, it's now like a 7-8 year obsession with is Dota 2, right? Dota 2 is a big game, but it has a extreme combinatorial space, right? Because you have, you know, dozens of heroes, and every game there's 10 different heroes in the match, right? And so you have this gigantic combination space, and therefore it takes a long time for it to get boring because you're seeing different combinations and meta patterns, and obviously it's an online multiplayer game, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity and interest. But that's another game that has really taken the combinatorial thing, and you know, I've got thousands and thousands of hours into it, and still play it, you know, still enjoy it. Not as much as I used to, but I'm still actively playing it and have got like really a lot invested in there, and don't feel like it was a waste of time. It's a game that I really love, and I enjoy being good at it and all that stuff. So something to think about, right? Something to think about from an indie game perspective of what are the kinds of games like this that are out there, the kinds of designs, the kinds of possibilities where we can take something small, make it for cheap, test it in the market, potentially make money from it. I think it's a good business strategy that overlaps with an interesting game design. So I think it's worth being aware of and looking at. let me know if you've played these games, if you enjoyed them, or you liked them or didn't like them. Drop me a comment down below. Drop a like on the video for the algorithm. I've put a link to the Level 2 Game Dev newsletter in the description box. That's a newsletter by me and Charles Amat from Infallible Code, our partner channel. Drop your email in there if you'd like to receive a once-a-month email and also be notified about our upcoming Unity for Software Developers paid course that we're working on. We're going to release that in the coming months. I'm really excited about that. And yeah, if you're not subscribed already, please consider doing so. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.